So the prophet Ezekiel has carried out lots of prophetic actions, visual proclamations of God's truth and what's going to happen for God's people because they've been rejecting God. And this one must have been the most difficult of all. Most of them were just confusing. Like, you want me to do what? How does that make any sense? But then this one, his wife dies, and he's told not to mourn. Now, not to mourn at all, but to don't outwardly show the mourning. There is a grief process. There's rituals that take place when mourning the loss of a loved one. It's acknowledged. It's what you do in society. And it's healthy to carry out these mourning rituals, these grieving rituals. But God tells him, don't do that. This will be another prophetic action. And then, the next morning, the very next day, God's people come to Ezekiel's doorstep, explain yourself. He's still grieving interiorly of the loss of his wife. And he has to explain himself to God's people. How difficult that must have been. But he was a prophet who was faithful to God, who devoted himself, and in this devotion did his best to carry that out. You have to, in devotion, sometimes recognize the emotion and say, not now. So now let's go to our gospel. A rich young man comes up to Jesus, possibly in his 20s, late 20s maybe, and asks, what must I do to have eternal life? And Jesus says, keep the commandments. And then all of a sudden, the emotional maturity of this rich young man shines through. He sounds like he's about 13 years old. Okay, which ones? All of them? No, but which ones? Jesus doesn't list off all 10. My guess is, I'm just wondering, if he lists off the ones that he already knew that this rich young man could check off. Yep, did that. Notice how Jesus didn't mention the first 3, which are about loving God. And then when he was told how to love God, give everything away. This particular young man needed to sell all that he had and then come follow God. Because he was clinging to his things that he had, and he wasn't loving God. And then he went away sad. So he allowed the emotion to dictate what he would do, which didn't allow him to love God. He went away sad because he had many things, and he wouldn't sell them for the love of God. Ezekiel was able to put away the external aspects of the grieving process. Say, not now, because God is calling me to something higher, something greater, for the sake of God's people. What area in our lives, what are we clinging to? Whether it's our own emotions or it's created things that's keeping us from truly devoting ourselves and loving God and carrying out in such a way that brings us to holiness, that brings us closer to God, that brings us not to sadness, but to true happiness, following Jesus.